There is a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. It is broken into fragments, recovered from the ruins of Nippur in central Iraq during the American excavations led by John Punnett Peters of the University of Pennsylvania beginning in the 1880s. The complete composition runs to 412 lines of Sumerian cuneiform. Sumerologists call it Inanna's descent to the netherworld. It describes a journey down into the place the Sumerians called the Kur, the Great Below, undertaken by the goddess Inanna. She passes through 7 gates. At each gate the gatekeeper takes something from her, and at the bottom of the 7 gates she is brought before 7 beings, the Anuna, who pronounce judgment. The poem is older than Homer by more than 1,000 years. It is older than the Hebrew Bible by nearly 2,000, and what those 7 beings do, and how their function maps onto the post-mortem judgment scenes, preserved in Egyptian, Greek, Vedic and Tibetan texts, written centuries later in places with no direct contact with Sumer, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed correspondences in the history of comparative religion. The composition is known to Assyriologists as Inanna's descent to the netherworld. The standard scholarly edition appears in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained at the University of Oxford, where it sits among the literary compositions of the old Babylonian schools that copied and recopied it from older Sumerian originals. The physical tablets we have are dated by paleography to the early 2nd millennium BCE. The composition itself is older. Samuel Noah Kramer, the Sumerologist who spent more than half a century reconstructing it from broken fragments scattered across museums in Philadelphia, Istanbul, Berlin and Baghdad, argued that the text was already a copy of an older oral and written tradition reaching back into the Third Dynasty period, the late 22nd century BCE. The structure of the descent is fixed. Inanna leaves her temples in the cities of Uruk, Akkad, Zabalam, Adab, Nippur, Kish and Eridu. She gathers her 7 divine powers, the Mi, and arrays them upon her body. She descends. At the outer gate of the Kur she is met by Neti, the chief gatekeeper. He goes to Ereshkigal, queen of the Great Below, and reports who has arrived. Ereshkigal instructs him to open the 7 bolts of the Kur one by one. At each gate Neti takes from Inanna one of the powers she has arrayed. At the first gate her shugura, the crown of the step. At the second her measuring rod and line of lapis lazuli. At the third the double strand of beads upon her neck. At the fourth the twin stones upon her breast. Fourth, the twin stones upon her breast. At the fifth the gold ring on her wrist. At the 6th, the breastplate called Come Man Come. At the 7th, the royal robe, called the Palla. Naked and bowed low, she is brought into the throne room, and in the throne room are seated the Anuna, the 7 judges of the Great Below, and they fix upon her the eye of death. This is the central scene. 7 gates, 7 strippings, 7 beings, 1 verdict. The conventional reading of this scene is that it is the founding charter of the Mesopotamian funeral cult. Inanna's death and return prefigures the agricultural seasons, the descent and return of the year. Read this way: the 7 Anuna are personifications of cosmic order rendering judgment on a transgressor. This reading is defensible. It is the consensus reading of mainstream Sumerology. The thesis of this video is different. It is that the structural elements of the scene, the fixed number of beings rendering judgment after a progressive stripping at gates, recur in post-mortem texts from cultures that had no demonstrable contact with Sumer for centuries or millennia after the Sumerian original was composed. Egyptian, Vedic, Buddhist, Mesoamerican, and Platonic post-mortem scenes contain different numbers and different names, but they contain the same architecture. And one specific element, the stripping of memory at one of the gates, recurs across enough of them that the alternative tradition reading, which holds that the Sumerian Anuna scene is the oldest preserved diagram of a process the ancients understood and we no longer do, has not been seriously engaged by mainstream comparative religion. If you find that the academic literature on the Sumerian descent texts has been incomplete, if you suspect there are compositions still sitting in museum drawers waiting for someone to read them not as mythology but as record, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you've been carrying. The rest of us continue. The mainstream Assyriological reading of Inanna's descent rests on 3 pillars. The first is the agricultural cycle hypothesis. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of fertility, sexuality, and the morning and evening star, descends to the underworld and is held there. While she's below, all sexual and agricultural reproduction in the upper world ceases. The bull does not mount the cow. The donkey does not mount the jenny. The young man does not impregnate the young woman in the street. When she's returned on condition that a substitute take her place, and the substitute is her husband Dumuzi, the shepherd king, the seasons resume. Read this way, the text is a myth of the seasons, comparable to the Greek myth of Persephone, which most Hellenists believe was influenced through Phoenician intermediaries by older Mesopotamian originals. The second pillar is the cult foundation hypothesis. Samuel Noah Kramer, working in the 1940s and 50s on the Nippur tablets in the University Museum collection, proposed that the text was the libretto for an annual liturgical performance at the Great Inanna temples in Uruk and Nippur. The 7 gates, the stripping, the judgment, the substitution of Dumuzi. These were dramatized by priestesses and priests in a ritual that consolidated the temple's claim to mediate between the upper world and the great below. Read this way, the text is performative theology, not a description of any real geography or any real ontology. The third pillar is the political allegory reading. Stephanie Dalley, the Oxford Assyriologist who produced the most widely used English anthology of Mesopotamian myth, Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press in 1989, has emphasized that Inanna's descent reflects the political tensions of city-state Sumer. Inanna's claim to the great below is read as a power grab against her sister Ereshkigal, the long-established queen of that domain. The 7 Anuna who judge her are the legitimate council of the underworld pushing back against an invasive cult. Read this way, the text is ancient politics dressed in cosmic language. These 3 readings are not in competition. Most modern Sumerologists hold all 3 simultaneously, weighting them differently. The agricultural reading explains the substitution of Dumuzi and the seasonal return. The cult foundation reading explains why the text was preserved and copied for over 1,000 years across multiple temple schools. The political reading explains the specific named cities and their order. Taken together, they account for the text as the Sumerians used it. What none of the 3 readings addresses directly is the question of why the architecture, fixed number judgment by multiple beings after progressive stripping at gates, appears in other places where it has no plausible connection to Sumer. The Egyptian funerary texts of the New Kingdom describe the deceased standing before 42 assessors in the Hall of Mayat, each assessor specialized in a particular sin, and the heart being weighed against the feather of truth. The Platonic myth of air, narrated in the closing pages of the Republic and composed approximately 375 BCE, describes a man returned from death who witnessed 3 judges sorting souls between 2 openings in the meadow and souls drinking from a river of forgetting before their return. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol, the Book of Liberation in the Intermediate State, written down in the 14th century CE, but drawing on an oral tradition many centuries older, lists multiple peaceful and wrathful deities encountered in sequence. These are not the same texts. They share no common script, no common language, no plausible chain of transmission, but they share an architecture, and the Sumerian text is the oldest written attestation of it. The break in the conventional reading is the work of researchers outside mainstream Assyriology who refuse to bracket the structural question. Mainstream Sumerology, as a discipline, generally restricts itself to questions internal to the Sumerian textual corpus. What does the word mean? How does this line scan? What does this tablet? Correct in the older reconstruction. The discipline is rigorous within its borders, but the borders exclude the comparative question. Comparative religion is a different discipline. Cross-cultural structuralism is a third, and the question of whether the Sumerian scene is a record of something the Sumerians believe to be ontologically real, not just liturgically useful, is a question that few academic specialists will engage, because it is not the question their field rewards. The first published serious engagement with the comparative question came in the early 20th century from researchers working outside Sumerology. Sir James George Fraser, the Scottish anthropologist and author of The Golden Bough, treated Inanna's descent in his work on dying and rising gods, but his interest was the agricultural cycle question. He did not pursue the structural parallel with the post-mortem judgment scenes of Egypt and India. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, did pursue it, in his late work on archetypes. He proposed that the descent narratives across cultures were expressions of a single underlying psychic process, the encounter of the conscious mind with what he called the self. His proposal was that the structural parallel was explained by the structure of the human psyche, not by any historical transmission or any common metaphysical referent. This is the inherited frame in most modern comparative religion. Same architecture, same psyche, no further claim. The serious break with this frame came from Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin, born in Baku in 1920 and trained in economics in London before turning to ancient languages, published The 12th Planet in 1976. The book argued that the Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki, were physical beings whose descent narratives were not mythology but historical record. Sitchin's reading of Inanna's descent was that the 7 gates were stages of a physical descent, through atmospheric layers, through a literal subsurface installation, through stages of a process he described in technical rather than theological terms. He proposed that the stripping at each gate was the surrender of objects with specific functions, not symbolic regalia, and that the judgment at the bottom was an evaluation conducted by beings with administrative authority over a process he interpreted as something other than post-mortem judgment. Sitchin's reading is rejected by mainstream Assyriology. The rejection has been characterizational rather than specific. No Assyriologist has published a line-by-line counter-reading of his interpretation of the descent text. The rejection has taken the form of statements that he is not credentialed in Sumerian, that he misreads cuneiform signs, that he projects modern concepts onto ancient texts. These statements are largely correct as statements about his philological method. They are not engagements with the structural question he raised. The structural question was taken up more carefully by Mauro Biglino. Biglino, born in San Remo in 1950, worked for 30 years as a translator of Biblical Hebrew for the Italian editions of the Roman Catholic Church. He published The Book That Will Forever Change Our Ideas About the Bible in 2010, and in subsequent works has applied to Sumerian and Hebrew texts the same translational rigour he applied to the Vatican editions. His position is more careful than Sitchin's. He does not argue that the Anunna are extraterrestrials. He argues that the structural element of the descent, particularly the stripping and the judgment, corresponds to elements in the Hebrew text of Genesis and Ezekiel that have been smoothed over in standard translations. He argues that the structural element preserved across Sumerian, Hebrew, Egyptian, and Greek post-mortem texts is the residue of something the cultures all knew, that the Hebrew Bible inherited from older Mesopotamian sources, and that mainstream translation has obscured. Biglino's methodology is the relevant point. He is not arguing from cosmology to text. He is arguing from text to cosmology. He reads the surviving Hebrew and Sumerian against each other, identifies the structural elements that recur, and asks what those structural elements would have to be records of for the recurrence to be other than coincidence. The third figure relevant to the break is Alan Bond. Bond is an aerospace engineer at Reaction Engines, the British propulsion company. He is not a Sumerologist. His relevant work, conducted in collaboration with the spacecraft systems engineer Mark Hempsel, formerly of the University of Bristol, was on a different Sumerian text, the Planisphere of Nineveh, the astronomical tablet in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection. Their methodology established a precedent: take the Sumerian text at its informational face value, run the calculation, and see whether the calculation produces a coherent result. In the case of the Planisphere, it produced a date in the 3rd millennium BCE that matches an astronomical event independently confirmable by orbital simulation software available to any researcher. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond has worked on rocket propulsion systems. Hempsel has worked with the European Space Agency. Their credentials in the aerospace and astronomical fields are independently verifiable. Their analysis of the planisphere was published in 2008 by an academic press, with the orbital calculations laid out and the source software named. The Bond and Hempsel methodology has not been applied to Inanna's descent for the simple reason that the descent text is narrative rather than data. There are no orbital calculations to run on a description of 7 gates. But the methodology, take the text at face value as an informational record, then test the result against independent evidence, is the methodology that breaks the conventional reading. Applied to the comparative question, it asks, if the Sumerian text and its parallels across Egypt, India, Greece, Tibet, and Mesoamerica all record the same architecture, what is the simplest hypothesis that accounts for the recurrence? And the simplest hypothesis is not always the one that mainstream comparative religion has settled on. The implication, if the structural recurrence is not coincidence and not psychic archetype, is that the cultures preserving the texts were preserving a record of a process they understood to be real, not metaphorically real, not psychologically real, procedurally real, as one might describe a road or a courthouse, or the protocol followed by a customs officer at a frontier. This implication has been pursued most carefully not in mainstream comparative religion, but in what is sometimes called the perennialist tradition. The perennialist position, articulated in the 20th century by writers like René Guénon, Frithjof Schuon, Ananda Coomaraswamy, and Houston Smith, holds that the metaphysical claims of the world's religions converge on a small number of structural truths, and that the convergence is explained by the truths being substantially the same. The Sumerian Anuna, the Egyptian 42 assessors, the Tibetan deities of the Bardo, the Vedic Yama, the Platonic judges. These are not the same beings, but they are records, in different languages and pictorial conventions, of the same procedure. The procedure has a number of named elements. Each element appears in the text in slightly different form. Taken together, they constitute the architecture. The first element is the geography. The post-mortem scene is located. It is not nowhere. In the Sumerian text, it is the Kur, the great below, accessed through a specific gate. In the Egyptian text, it is the Duat, accessed by descent through the western horizon. In Greek text, it is the meadow of air, accessed by descent through a chasm. In the Tibetan text, it is the Bardo, the intermediate state, with its own geography described in detail. In the Vedic and later Hindu material, it is Yama's realm in the south. In the K'iche Maya Popol Vuh, it is Xibalba, accessed through a cave in the Mexican lowlands. The cultures describing it locate it. The geographies do not match each other in any cartographic sense. The descriptions are not of the same place by any geographical test, but the descriptions are of a place. The intermediate state is treated as a location, with directions of approach and departure. The second element is the gates or stages. Inanna passes through 7. The Egyptian deceased passes through 21 in some versions of the Book of the Dead, fewer in others. The Bardo has 6 successive stages in the standard Tibetan enumeration. The Platonic soul passes through a meadow, and then through a region of forgetting, and then through a tube of light. The K'iche twins pass through 5 houses of trial in Xibalba. The numbers vary. The structural fact does not. The journey is staged. It is not a single transition. It is a sequence of transitions, and at each transition something happens. The third element is the stripping. At each gate something is taken. In the Sumerian text it is the items of regalia, crown, lapis rod, beads, breaststones, ring, breastplate, robe. In the Egyptian text it is various spiritual components, the rendering of the heart, the negotiation with each of the assessors. In the Tibetan text it is the dissolution of the elements of the psychophysical complex, the dissolution of earth, water, fire, air and consciousness in successive stages. In the Platonic text it is the drinking from the river of forgetfulness, which strips memory. In the Vedic and Hindu material it is the burning away of karmic deposits. In the K'iche text it is the trials of the houses, the house of darkness, the house of cold, the house of jaguars, the house of bats, the house of razors, each of which strips the twins of some specific resource. The fourth element is the stripping of memory. This is the element that has drawn the most interest from researchers in the alternative tradition, because it is the most specific and the least likely to be invented twice by accident. In the Platonic myth of air, the souls about to return to incarnation drink from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and the amount they drink determines how much they retain of the world they have just left. Those who drink more remember less. Himself is prevented from drinking. He returns with memory intact, which is why Plato is able to use him as a narrator. In the Tibetan Bardo, the consciousness is repeatedly instructed by the Lama reading the Book of the Dead not to be confused by the visions, not to be drawn into the wrong wombs by misperception. The misperception is explicitly described as a forgetting of the true nature. In the Vedic and later Hindu material, the standard term for the post-mortem pre-incarnation forgetting is Brahma, delusion, with the function of allowing the new life to begin without the burden of the old. In Sumerian text, the parallel is less direct. The Kur is described as the place where the dead eat clay and drink brackish water, a description that has been read by mainstream Sumerology as straightforwardly grim, but which Biglino and others have read as a description of a deliberate diminishment of faculties. The fifth element is the judgment. The judgment is not adversarial in the modern legal sense. It is more like an assessment, an inspection. In the Sumerian text, the Anuna fixed the eye of death upon Inanna, and her verdict is rendered. In the Egyptian text, the heart is weighed against the feather of truth. In the Platonic text, the three judges sought souls between two openings. In the Tibetan text, the Lord of Death Yama produces the mirror of karma, in which the dead see their own actions reflected and respond, not to the judge but to the reflection. The sixth element is the assignment. After the assessment, the soul is sent on. Where it is sent depends on the assessment. In some texts it returns to embodied life. In some it is detained. In some it dissolves. The Sumerian Inanna's case is unusual because she does not stay. She is returned to the upper world by intervention. The standard human case in Mesopotamian theology is detention in the Kur. The Egyptian case is more various. The Tibetan case is rebirth into one of 6 realms. The Vedic case is rebirth in a realm corresponding to the karmic balance. The Platonic case is a choice of new life, made by the soul itself, immediately before drinking from Lethe and being reborn. If the cultures preserving these texts are preserving records of a process they understood as real, the question of why the records vary is the question of how the cultures encoded what they understood. Different languages, different pictorial conventions, different number systems, different specific names for the beings encountered. But the same procedure underneath. The forensic question is whether this hypothesis is testable. It is partly testable. 2 specific predictions follow from it. First, the cultures preserving the most internally consistent records, that is, records whose internal structure does not require ad hoc patches to account for variant readings, should be the cultures with the most direct access to the original informational source. The Egyptian funerary corpus is internally extraordinarily consistent across 2,000 years. So is the Tibetan Bardo material. So is the Sumerian. The Greek material is more synthetic, drawing on Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources through Pythagorean and Orphic intermediaries. The prediction is that the most synthetic traditions should show more inconsistency. The most direct traditions should show less. This prediction holds. Second, if the procedure is real, descriptions of it should appear in cultures that had no contact with the cultures previously discussed. The Yoruba Ifá divination corpus, oral and only partially committed to writing in the 19th and 20th centuries, describes a post-mortem scenario in which the soul appears before Olodumare, the creator, and gives an account of itself. The Hopi creation tradition describes the spirit, after death, going west to the Sipapuni, the place of emergence, where it is met by a deity who evaluates its conduct. These are independent attestations. They were recorded by anthropologists working in the 20th century who had no prior knowledge of the Mesopotamian or Egyptian comparanda. The descriptions converge. The convergence is the data. A third element of the implication, less often discussed, is what it would mean for the conventional dating of the Sumerian corpus. If the descent texts are recording a procedure rather than inventing one, the question of when the procedure was understood to operate becomes separate from the question of when the texts were composed. The Old Babylonian copies of Inanna's descent date to the period roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE. The Ur-3rd dynasty Sumerian original underlying them dates to approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE. But the procedure the text describes is presented within the text as already ancient. The Anuna are old gods even within the world of the Sumerian poem. They are not innovators. They are sitting on thrones that were already old when Inanna arrived. If you want to check the references in this section, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford is open to the public. The University of Pennsylvania Museum's catalogue of Sumerian tablets is searchable. The Book of the Dead translations are available from multiple publishers in critical editions. The Bardo Thirdol is available in W. Y. Evans Wentz's 1927 translation, and the more recent Robert Thurman version published by Bantam. The references are not hidden. The question is whether they have been read together with the seriousness their structural convergence demands. The academic response to the structural comparative question has been, in a phrase, silence followed by characterization. Mainstream Assyriology has not published a systematic rebuttal of the structural argument, because the argument is not made within Assyriology. It is made adjacent to Assyriology, in the spaces between the disciplines, by writers like Sitchin and Biglino, who do not hold positions in major university departments, and whose books are sold in popular rather than academic channels. The response to those writers is well documented. They have been characterized as fringe, as untrained, as projecting modern concepts onto ancient texts. The characterization is asymmetric. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Characterization requires only a label. The asymmetry is what the audience here notices. A peer-reviewed engagement would require a comparative religion specialist to read the Sumerian, the Egyptian, the Vedic, the Platonic, the Tibetan, and the Mesoamerican materials together, in their original languages where possible, and produce a systematic account of why the structural convergence is to be explained by independent invention, by transmission, or by archetype, with the evidence weighed against each hypothesis. This work has been attempted in isolated pieces. It has not been attempted comprehensively, in any peer-reviewed venue, against the comparative claims as the alternative tradition has formulated them. The closest approximation in mainstream academic publishing is the work of Jonathan Z. Smith, the late University of Chicago historian of religions, who argued in works like Map is Not Territory and Imagining Religion that comparative religion as a discipline tends to manufacture the very convergences it then claims to discover. Smith's work is serious. It applies to some comparative claims and not to others. It does not engage the specific structural claim made about the post-mortem judgment architecture. The pattern is familiar. The Bond and Hempsel analysis of the planisphere of Nineveh was published in 2008 by an academic press, with the orbital calculations laid out and the source software identified. The mainstream response was silence in the specialist journals and characterization in the popular press. No counter-calculation has been published. The calculation produces a result that places the astronomical observation on the night of the 29th of June, 3123 BCE, and the corresponding event, a fireball over the eastern Mediterranean, possibly the impact at the location now identified with Köfels in the Austrian Alps, has been independently considered by impact cratering specialists. The work has not been refuted. It has been ignored in venues where it might have been refuted. The Sitchin reading is more vulnerable because his philological method genuinely is unrigorous in specific places. Cuneiform signs are not what he says they are in a number of cases. His reading of the Sumerian word Anunnaki as composed of three elements meaning those who from heaven to earth came is contested by Sumerologists who read the word's morphology differently. These are specific objections. They have been raised. They are answerable on the philological terms in which they are raised. What has not been answered is the structural question Sitchin raised, even when his etymologies fail. Why does the architecture occur, and if the recurrence is not coincidence, what is the simplest hypothesis that accounts for it? The Biglino case is interestingly different. Biglino was a working translator inside the Roman Catholic Church for 30 years. His Hebrew is professionally credentialed, his Sumerian is less so, but his focus is the Hebrew text and the Mesopotamian text, from which the Hebrew tradition demonstrably borrowed. He is a translator, not a Sumerologist, and his arguments are translational, not philological. He shows where standard translations have smoothed inconsistencies that the consonantal Hebrew text preserves. The mainstream response to Biglino has been less characterizational than the response to Sitchin, because the philological objections that defeat Sitchin do not defeat Biglino. The response to Biglino has been, instead, professional distance. His books are sold in Italian academic bookshops. They are rarely cited in Italian or international peer-reviewed Hebrew Bible studies. He is treated as outside the conversation. The dismissal is by omission. The forensic skeptic audience for this material has identified the pattern. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist, made a parallel observation in a different field, the field of interstellar object research, when he proposed in 2017 that the object designated Oumuamua was anomalous enough in its behavior to warrant the hypothesis of artificial origin as worth considering. The mainstream response was characterization rather than engagement. Loeb's credentials are unimpeachable. He has chaired a Harvard department. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. The hypothesis was nonetheless treated as professionally embarrassing, rather than as a hypothesis to be evaluated. The pattern is the same as the pattern that applies to the comparative religion question. A claim that crosses the implicit boundary of what is professionally permissible is treated as a credentialing problem, rather than as a hypothesis to be tested. Loeb has documented this in his book Extraterrestrial, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in 2021. The structural question is not made less serious by being raised by writers who lack the right credentials. It is made less safe to engage with. The career incentives in mainstream comparative religion run against engagement. The career incentives in mainstream Assyriology run against engagement. The career incentives in Egyptology, in classical philosophy, in Buddhist studies, all run against the comparative question, because each discipline is rewarded for depth within its own materials, not for the kind of cross-disciplinary structural synthesis the question requires. The discipline that would historically have been responsible for such synthesis, comparative religion as a unified discipline, has spent the last 40 years dismantling its own unifying assumptions in the wake of postmodern critiques of universalism. Jonathan Z. Smith's contribution was foundational to that dismantling. The discipline now operates with a strong default skepticism toward any structural claim that crosses cultural boundaries. The result is that the question stands open in a particular and rare way. It has not been refuted. It has been declared, professionally, the kind of question one does not ask. The audience that watches these videos is the audience that notices that. The viewer who has read both the Book of the Dead and the Barda Thodol and the Republic and the Popol Vuh, and who has noticed for themselves that something about the architecture repeats, is a viewer who has noticed something the discipline has decided not to engage with. Whether the convergence is what the perennialist tradition takes it to be, preserved records of an actual procedure, or what mainstream comparative religion takes it to be when it engages at all, independent invention from shared psychological substrate, is the question that has not been answered seriously, because it has not been asked seriously by the institutions that would have to ask it for an answer to count. To understand what is at stake in the question, it helps to spend some time inside the world that produced the Sumerian text. The Sumerians lived in the alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, from approximately the 5th millennium BCE through the early 2nd millennium BCE, when their language gradually ceased to be spoken in the streets and survived only as the liturgical and scholarly language of the temples and the scribal schools. The cities they built, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Adab, Zabalam, were the world's first cities by every measure historians use. They had populations in the tens of thousands, they had writing, they had bureaucracy, they had a calendar based on careful astronomical observation, they had a literature. The literature includes the texts we are discussing: Inanna's Descent, the death of Gilgamesh, the death of Ur-Namma, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. Each of these is a composition that addresses the question of what happens after death. Each of them was copied repeatedly in the scribal schools by scribes whose careers depended on accurate transmission. The texts were not entertainment. They were the cultural memory of a civilization that took the question of what happens at the gates of the Kur seriously enough to commission generation after generation of trained men to copy the answer. The scribal school at Nippur, where many of the surviving Sumerian literary tablets were copied, operated from approximately the early 2nd millennium BCE through the middle of that millennium. The school was attached to the great temple of Enlil, the Eka, which was for centuries the most important religious centre in Sumer. Scribes trained there from childhood. They learned by copying. They copied Inanna's Descent. They copied the death of Gilgamesh. They learned the 7 gates, the 7 Anuna, the Eye of Death, the substitution of Dumuzi, by writing them out hundreds of times. The American excavations at Nippur, conducted in successive seasons from the 1880s through the early 20th century by teams from the University of Pennsylvania and later the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, recovered thousands of these school tablets. They are now in the University Museum in Philadelphia, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Hilprecht Sammlung at the University of Jena, and elsewhere. They are the primary documentary basis for our knowledge of Sumerian literature. The picture they paint of the Sumerian afterlife is consistent. It is not a happy picture. The Kur is described as a place of dust. Its inhabitants eat clay. They drink brackish water. They are clothed like birds, in feathers. They sit in darkness. The conventional Assyriological reading of these descriptions is that they reflect a relatively early stage in the development of afterlife theology, a stage in which the underworld is grim, undifferentiated, and shared by all the dead, without the sorting into reward and punishment that later traditions like the Egyptian or the Zoroastrian or the Christian or the Islamic developed. This reading is correct as far as it goes. The Sumerian afterlife is grim. The Sumerian dead do eat clay. The text says so. But the reading is incomplete because it skips over the question of what the dust and the clay and the bird clothing are. The texts treat them as the condition of the dead in the Kur. The alternative reading, the one Biglino and others have pursued, is that the dust and clay are descriptions of a deliberate diminishment, a stripping not unlike the stripping at the 7 gates, but applied to those who remain. The bird clothing in particular has drawn attention. Birds in Sumerian iconography are associated with the Lamassu, the protective spirits, and also with the wings of the Anuna themselves in some renderings. The dead in bird clothing are dressed in the cast-off iconography of a higher order of beings. The reading is contested. The text supports both readings. The world the Sumerians lived in was a world in which the boundary between the realm of the gods and the realm of humans was treated as physically present rather than metaphorically distant. The ziggurats, the stepped temple towers that dominated each Sumerian city, were understood as platforms where the gods could descend. The great ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu in approximately the 21st century BCE and restored by Nabonidus in the 6th century BCE, was the staircase between the upper temple, where the god could sit, and the city below. The Sumerians did not regard the gods as abstractions. They regarded them as agents with addresses. The address of the Anuna of the underworld was the Kur. The address of Enki was Eridu. The address of Inanna was Uruk. The addresses were physical. The agents were considered to inhabit them. This is the cosmological context in which Inanna's descent operates. When the text says Inanna descends, it does not mean she sinks into a dream. It means she travels. The Sumerians believed she travelled. The scribes who copied the text were not copying a metaphor. They were copying a record. Whether the record is true, whether there is a Kur in the sense the Sumerians meant, is the question we are unable to answer from outside the framework of Sumerian belief. But the question of whether the Sumerians took it as record is answerable, and the answer is yes. The same is true of the parallel cultures. The Egyptian funerary corpus was not produced as entertainment. It was produced at enormous expense by the most highly trained scribes in the kingdom, copied into the burial chamber of the deceased, illustrated with vignettes of the post-mortem journey, and equipped with spells that were intended to function in the post-mortem environment. The papyrus of Ani, discovered at Thebes in 1888, and now held in the British Museum, runs to 78 feet in length and contains some 200 chapters. It is one of the longest funerary papyri to survive. It was made for a single man, Ani, a scribe of the Temple of Amun in Thebes during the 19th dynasty, around 1250 BCE. The work that went into making it was the work of a society that believed Ani was going to need it. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol was produced under different circumstances but with the same orientation. The tradition holds that the text was composed by Padmasambhava, the Indian Buddhist master who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century CE, and concealed by him until the conditions were right for its rediscovery. The first written redaction of the text now available dates to the 14th century, and the standard English translation by W. Y. Evans Wentz, published in 1927, drew on a manuscript provided by the Sikkim-trained scholar Kazi Dawa Samdup. The text was read aloud at the deathbed of the dying and continued to be read for 49 days after death, the standard period of the bardo. The function of the reading was to guide the consciousness of the dead person through the stages of the intermediate state. The text gives explicit instructions. Do not be afraid of the peaceful deities. Do not be afraid of the wrathful deities. Recognize them as projections of your own consciousness. Do not be drawn into the lower wombs. The reader of the text, the lama, or sometimes a family member trained for the role, was understood to be performing a real function for the dead. The text was not literature in our sense. It was a procedural manual. The Platonic myth of air sits at the end of the Republic in Book 10, composed by Plato in Athens approximately 375 BCE. The myth comes after the long argument about justice that occupies the previous 9 books. Plato gives it to us as a story told by a man, son of Armenios, of Pamphylia, who died in battle but whose body did not decay, and who returned to life on the funeral pyre to report what he had seen. Describes the meadow, the judges, the openings, one for souls going up to the heavens for reward, the other for souls going down for punishment. He describes the return of the souls after their period of reward or punishment, the gathering at the plain of Lethe in the meadow of forgetfulness, the drinking from the river of forgetting, and the choice of a new life. Plato presents the myth as a story. He does not vouch for it as fact, but he ends the Republic with it. The most serious philosophical work of the most influential philosopher in the Greek tradition ends with this account. It is not casual material. Plato's source for the myth is debated. Some scholars trace it to Orphic tradition, the mystery religion strand of Greek religion that traced its origins to the singer Orpheus, and that incorporated explicit doctrines of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. Others trace it to Pythagorean tradition, which Plato encountered during his time in southern Italy. The Pythagoreans held, like the Orphics, that the soul was reborn into successive bodies, and that one of the goals of philosophical practice was to remember previous lives. The connection to the Lethe motif is direct. The river of forgetting is what makes remembering hard. The historical question of where Plato got the myth is partly answerable. Orphism predates Plato by at least 2 centuries, Pythagoreanism by 1 to 2 centuries. The Orphic and Pythagorean strands are themselves connected by the testimony of ancient writers to Egyptian and Phoenician religious practice. Phoenician religious practice is connected to Mesopotamian religious practice through long-attested cultural contact across the Levantine corridor. The chain of transmission from Sumer to Plato is not direct, but it is also not absent. The texts of Mesopotamia were known in some form in the Eastern Mediterranean by the time of Plato. Whether Plato knew Inanna's descent specifically is impossible to determine. Whether the structural elements he uses, judges, openings, forgetting, return, could have reached him through cultural transmission from the same source, the Sumerian text records, is plausible enough that the conventional reading of the myth as Plato's invention does not exhaust the possibilities. The Vedic and later Hindu material is harder to date. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, is conventionally dated to approximately 1500 BCE, though the oral tradition behind it is held by Indian scholarship to be much older. The Rig Veda has its own version of the post-mortem scene, with Yama as the first man to die, and therefore the first to walk the path to the realm of the dead, and the dead following the path he opened. The later Upanishads, composed between approximately 800 and 300 BCE, developed the doctrine of samsara, the cycle of rebirth, and the doctrine of karma, the moral law that determines the conditions of each rebirth. The architecture of judgment, forgetting, and assignment is present in the Vedic and Upanishadic material. The vocabulary is Sanskrit. The procedure is recognizable. The Mesoamerican material was recorded latest. The Popol Vuh, the K'iche Maya creation narrative, was first written down in the 16th century CE by a K'iche scribe in the Latin alphabet, after the Spanish conquest had destroyed most of the older pre-conquest codices. The K'iche tradition preserved in the Popol Vuh describes the journey of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Ixbalanque, into Xibalba, the underworld, where they pass through 5 houses of trial. The houses are the House of Darkness, the House of Cold, the House of Jaguars, the House of Bats, and the House of Razors. At each house, the twins must survive a specific test. The architecture is recognizable. The numbers differ. The structural elements persist. What the cultures share is the architecture, not the specifics, not the names, not the iconography. The architecture, descent, gates, stripping, judgment, assignment, and in some traditions a return mediated by forgetting. This is the pattern the Yam structural argument identifies. Its persistence across cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles is the data that the conventional readings have not adequately explained. The Yoruba material is even later in its written recording. The Ifá divination corpus, the central religious text of the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria, was preserved orally for centuries before the systematic transcription work of the 20th century. The corpus contains some 256 major divisions, each of which contains hundreds of verses. The corpus describes, among many other things, the post-mortem path. The soul, in Yoruba theology, returns to Olodumare, the supreme creator, and gives an account of itself. The account is compared to the destiny the soul chose for itself before incarnation. The comparison is the judgment. The soul is then assigned to its next condition, return to the ancestral pool, rebirth into the family, or other outcomes determined by the assessment. The architecture is present. The vocabulary is Yoruba. The procedure is recognizable. The Hopi tradition, recorded by anthropologists working in the 19th and 20th centuries with elders of the Hopi pueblos in northern Arizona, describes the spirit after death traveling west to the Sipa Puni, the place of emergence, where the spirit world meets the world of the living. The spirit is met by Masor, the keeper of the upper world. The meeting is the judgment. The spirit is assigned to its next condition. The architecture is present. The vocabulary is Hopi. The procedure is recognizable. the Zoroastrian material from ancient Iran provides another well-attested case. The Avesta, the primary Zoroastrian scripture, was preserved orally for centuries before being committed to writing in the Sasanian period, between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE. The texts describe the soul, 3 days after death, approaching the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of judgment that spans the gulf between this world and the next. On the bridge, the soul is met by 3 judging divinities: Mithra, the god of covenant; Srosha, the god of hearing and obedience; Rashnu, the god who holds the balance. The 3 weigh the soul's deeds. If the good deeds outweigh the evil, the bridge broadens for the soul, and the soul crosses into the house of song, the Zoroastrian paradise. If the evil deeds outweigh the good, the bridge narrows to the width of a razor, and the soul falls into the house of lies. The Zoroastrian post-mortem architecture predates the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and was probably formulated in the early 1st millennium BCE, with roots in the older Indo-Iranian religious matrix that also produced the Vedic material. The Zoroastrian scene shares with the Sumerian, the Egyptian, and the Platonic the same architecture: multiple judging beings, an assessment, and assignment. With the Egyptian specifically, it shares the element of moral weighing. With Plato, it shares the small fixed set of judging beings, in this case 3, the same number reports. The Zoroastrian case sits on a transmission corridor. Iranian religious ideas demonstrably influenced Hellenistic Judaism, early Christianity, and Manichaeism. They may have influenced Plato through the Persian-Greek cultural contact that intensified in the period after the Greco-Persian Wars. The mainstream view is that the Zoroastrian architecture is not borrowed from the Mesopotamian. The religious systems are theologically incompatible at fundamental points, but that both may draw on an older, shared Indo-European or Proto-Indo-Iranian substrate that also produced elements of the Vedic post-mortem path. The substrate hypothesis brings us closer to the question Sitchin and Biglino are asking. If the architecture has a substrate, what is the substrate, and what does the substrate record? The texts agree, the architecture is fixed, the variables are local, what the cultures do not share is contact. The Yoruba and the Hopi had no contact with the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Tibetans, or the K'iche. The Yoruba tradition developed in West Africa from origins that archaeology traces back at least 2,000 years in the Niger River basin. The Hopi tradition developed in the American Southwest from origins that archaeology traces back to the ancestral Puebla cultures of the 1st millennium CE, with deeper roots in the older Anasazi and pre-Anasazi cultures. The Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Tibetan, and K'iche traditions belong to a partially overlapping Old World cultural matrix, in which transmission, however indirect, can be argued for. The Yoruba and the Hopi cannot be folded into that matrix without straining the evidence beyond what evidence can support. The convergence is therefore not adequately explained by diffusion. The mainstream comparative religion default to diffusion, as the explanation of cross-cultural similarity, has been a default since the 19th century. But it has been weakened progressively by the accumulation of attestations from cultures whose isolation from the relevant transmission routes is well documented. The Yoruba post-mortem architecture is the strongest case for the weakening. The Hopi case is the second strongest. The Aboriginal Australian materials, recorded by 20th century ethnographers working with traditional custodians in the central and northern parts of the continent, provide a third case. The Australian materials are particularly important because the Australian populations have been isolated from the Old World cultural matrix for between 30,000 and 60,000 years, depending on which migration model one accepts. Their independence is uncontested, and the post-mortem architecture they preserve, in the traditions of the Dreamtime and the journeys of the spirit after death across the country to specific sacred sites, contains the same structural elements: descent or journey, encounter with beings, assessment, assignment. The Aboriginal material is the case that is hardest for the diffusion hypothesis. It is also the case that is hardest for the independent psychological invention hypothesis to handle, because the specificity of the structural elements that recur, the gates, the stripping, the judgment by multiple beings, the forgetting, is greater than would be expected if the convergence were merely the expression of universal psychological tendencies. What none of these cultures gives us by itself is a key. None of the records is presented as a manual the reader can follow in the way a modern technical document might be. Each record is presented within the framing of its own theology, its own vocabulary, its own ritual function. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is presented as spells for the deceased to recite. The Tibetan Thodol is presented as instructions for the Lama to read aloud. Inanna's Descent is presented as a song for liturgical performance. The Platonic myth of air is presented as a story told within a dialogue. The Popol Vuh is presented as the creation narrative of the K'iche people. The Zoroastrian Chinvat Bridge passage is presented as part of the Avestan ritual corpus. The texts do not announce themselves as records of a procedure. They have to be read together for the procedure to become visible across them, and reading them together is the cross-disciplinary work that mainstream comparative religion has decided not to do. This is the deepening of the question. The question has not become smaller as more data has come in. It has become larger. Each new culture whose post-mortem material has been recorded adds another data point. The data points cluster. The cluster has shape. The shape is the architecture, and the architecture's first preserved written form is the Sumerian Kur of Inanna's Descent, the tablet in the University Museum in Philadelphia, the 7 gates, and the 7 Anuna who fix the eye of death. The cross-cultural parallel that most directly echoes the structural elements of Inanna's Descent is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and within the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, the chapter of the negative confession in the Hall of Two Truths. The best preserved copy of chapter 125 is in the Papyrus of Ani, the funerary papyrus discovered at Thebes in 1888 by E. A. Wallace Budge, then assistant keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, and now held in the British Museum's Egyptian collection. The papyrus is approximately 78 feet long. It was made for a scribe named Ani, who served in the Temple of Amun at Thebes during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I in the early 13th century BCE. The papyrus is dated by paleography, and by the historical references it contains to approximately 1250 BCE. Chapter 1. 125 describes a scene that has no philological relationship to Inanna's descent, no shared language, no shared script, no demonstrable line of textual transmission, but the structural correspondence is exact. The deceased Ani is brought into a hall. The hall is called the Hall of Two Truths, or alternately the Hall of Mayat, after the goddess who personifies truth, order, and cosmic balance. The hall is occupied. It is occupied by 42 assessors, one for each of the 42 nomes, the administrative districts of ancient Egypt, though the number 42 also bears symbolic weight independently of the nome count. The assessors are not interchangeable. Each is named. Each is associated with a specific sin which it is that assessors function to detect. The names are preserved. They are recited by Ani in the negative confession. The negative confession is the verbal corollary of the scene. Ani addresses each of the 42 assessors by name and declares that he has not committed the sin associated with that assessor. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not killed men or women. I have not stolen grain. I have not purloined offerings. I have not stolen the property of the god. I have not uttered lies. I have not carried away food. I have not uttered curses. I have not committed adultery. The list continues to 42 items. Each item is a category of conduct. The completeness of the list is itself the point. The deceased declares innocence of every category of wrongdoing recognized in the Egyptian moral universe. After the negative confession comes the weighing. The heart of the deceased is placed on one pan of a balance. On the other pan is placed the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth. The weighing is conducted by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, with the result recorded by Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing. If the heart and the feather balance, the deceased is declared Makeru, true of voice, and is permitted to proceed into the fields of Iaru, the Egyptian paradise. If the heart is heavier than the feather, the heart is devoured by Amit, the composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The destruction of the heart is the final death, the second death, the death from which there is no return. The structural correspondence with the Sumerian scene is exact in its architecture and explicit in its differences in detail. The Sumerian scene has 7 judges. The Egyptian scene has 42. The Sumerian stripping occurs at the gates before the judgment. The Egyptian stripping is replaced by the weighing. The deceased is not stripped of objects, but the heart is examined for its moral weight. The Sumerian verdict is the fixing of the eye of death. The Egyptian verdict is the Ma'akeru declaration, or the devouring of the heart. The mechanisms differ, the architecture is the same. The relationship between the two texts has been examined by scholars working in both Egyptology and Assyriology. The mainstream conclusion is that there is no direct textual transmission between Sumerian and Egyptian funerary literature. The two cultures had limited contact at the time the texts were composed. Egyptian trade reached into the Levant. Sumerian trade reached into the Persian Gulf and across the Iranian plateau. Their commercial zones overlapped in Syria. But the funerary literature was not a commercial product. It was produced in temple scriptoria and copied for tomb use. The transmission of such material between cultures would have required scribal contact, and the scribal communities of Egypt and Sumer operated in different languages and different script systems. The conventional reading is therefore that the structural correspondence is not explained by transmission. If not transmission, then either independent invention from shared psychological substrate or shared origin in something neither culture invented. The independent invention hypothesis is plausible for some elements. Most cultures imagine death as a journey. Most cultures imagine some form of moral assessment of the deceased. These elements are broadly distributed and may reasonably be the result of universal features of human cognition about death. But the specific architectural elements, the fixed number of judging beings, the specific function of one or more of them, the role of stripping or weighing, the post-judgment forgetting in cultures that include rebirth, are more specific than the independent invention hypothesis comfortably accounts for. The Papyrus of Ani is one of approximately 190 known funerary papyri preserving versions of chapter 125. The earliest version of the negative confession in any preserved form appears in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, approximately the early 2nd millennium BCE, where it is found inscribed on the inner sides of the coffins of high officials. Older still are the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, inscribed on the walls of the burial chambers of the pyramids at Saqqara, beginning with the Pyramid of King Unas in approximately 2350 BCE. The pyramid texts contain elements that prefigure the negative confession and the weighing scene, though the full architecture of chapter 125 does not appear in them. The architecture develops over the course of the 2nd millennium BCE in the Egyptian corpus. The development of the architecture in the Egyptian corpus is the relevant point. The architecture is not a single composition by a single hand. It is the result of generations of priestly elaboration on a core scene. The core scene, the deceased, the assessors, the assessment, the assignment, is present from the earliest funerary inscriptions. The numbers and the specific names accrete over time. By the New Kingdom, the architecture is fully developed. By the time Ani's papyrus is copied, around 1250 BCE, the architecture is the standard format for a high-status burial. The Sumerian scene is older. The Old Babylonian copies of Inanna's descent date to the period approximately 1900 to 1600 BCE. The Third Dynasty original behind them dates to approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE. The Sumerian and Egyptian architectures are roughly contemporary in their developed forms, but the Sumerian developed earlier in the surviving record. The temporal precedence is suggestive but does not establish direction of transmission. What it establishes is that the two architectures emerged in the early 2nd millennium BCE in two cultures that did not, by mainstream consensus, exchange the relevant kind of religious material. The convergence is independent in the sense the mainstream uses the word. Whether the convergence is also independent in the deeper sense, whether the two cultures invented the architecture separately or inherited it separately from some prior shared source, is the question that has not been answered. The Papyrus of Ani is in the British Museum's Egyptian collection. It is available to any researcher who wants to check the references. The negative confession is translated in every major edition of the Book of the Dead, from Budge's original translation in 1895 through Raymond Faulkner's standard translation published by the British Museum Press in 1972 and revised in subsequent editions. The 42 assessors are listed by name. Their associated sins are listed by category. The reader who wants to compare them to the 7 Anuna of the Sumerian scene has the materials at hand. The strongest objection to the structural comparative argument is the one developed by Jonathan Z. Smith in a series of works published between the 1970s and the early 2000s at the University of Chicago. Smith's argument is not that the structural correspondences are imaginary. He grants that comparable elements can be identified across the post-mortem traditions of multiple cultures. His argument is that the act of identification is itself the construction of the convergence. The comparativist selects the elements that converge and discards the elements that diverge. The convergence is therefore an artifact of the comparativist's analytical method, not an independent feature of the data. Smith's argument has force. It is true that comparative religion as a discipline has historically selected for the apparent convergences and minimized the divergences. The Sumerian Anuna are not actually structurally identical to the Egyptian 42 assessors. They are not structurally identical to the Tibetan Bardo deities or the Platonic three judges or the K'iche lords of Xibalba. The number of beings differs in every case. Their specific functions differ. The mechanisms of the assessment differ. The post-assessment outcomes differ. A comparativist who emphasizes that all of them are multiple beings assessing the dead has selected one feature out of many and elevated it to the level of structural truth, while ignoring the features that distinguish them. Smith's argument is given its sharpest form in his essay, In Comparison, A Magic Dwells, published in his collection Imagining Religion by the University of Chicago Press in 1982. The essay surveys the history of comparative method in religious studies and concludes that the discipline has too often manufactured the comparanda it then claims to have discovered. The polemic is directed not at any particular comparative claim, but at the comparative method as such, on the grounds that the method's productivity is largely a function of the comparativist selection criteria. The objection deserves a serious response. The response is not that Smith is wrong about the selection problem, he is right about the selection problem. Any comparativist who is honest about the method will acknowledge that the choice of which features to compare is interpretive, and that different choices produce different convergences. The question is whether some convergences are robust enough to survive variation in the selection criteria. If a feature of the comparison is present regardless of which framing the comparativist applies, it is harder to dismiss as a selection artifact. The fixed number of judging beings feature is one such candidate. It is not a feature any comparativist would naturally invent if the text did not contain it. The texts contain it. 7 Anuna, 42 assessors, 3 judges in the Platonic scene, 6 in some Tibetan enumerations, 5 houses in the K'iche material. The specific numbers vary. The fact that the number is fixed and small, never a single judge, never an indefinitely large mass, is present across the corpus. It is not selected. It is read. The stripping or weighing feature is a second candidate. The specific mechanism varies. The fact that something is taken from the deceased, whether physical regalia, moral merit measured by weighing, or memory measured by drinking, recurs across the corpus. It is not selected. It is read. The post-assessment assignment feature is a third. The specific destinations vary. The fact that the assessment determines the destination, rather than the destination being preordained or random, recurs. It is not selected. It is read. 3 robust features across at least 6 cultures is not a definitive structural argument. It is, however, more than a selection artifact. Smith's critique requires that the comparativists demonstrate the robustness of features under variation in selection criteria. The criterion of robustness has been met for at least these 3 features. Whether further features are equally robust is a question that requires further work. The state of the debate is therefore not that the structural comparative argument has been refuted. It is that the argument has been challenged on methodological grounds, and the methodological challenge has been partly answered and partly not. The question remains genuinely unresolved. The Smith critique is the strongest countercase. The Smith critique is also itself an invitation, explicit in his later work, to do the comparative work more rigorously, not to abandon it. Whether the post-mortem judgment architecture argument can be made rigorously enough to meet his criterion is the open question. The consequences of the question being substantively answerable in the perennialist direction are not small. They would not require a rewriting of any specific historical timeline. They would not require revision of any radiocarbon dating, any stratigraphic sequence, any catalogue identification. They would not affect the dating of Inanna's descent or the papyrus of Eni or the Bardo Tadal or the Republic. The texts are where they are and date to when they date. What would shift is the framework within which the texts are read. If the cultures preserving them are preserving records of a procedure they understood as real, the texts are no longer adequately read as mythology, as liturgy, or as politics. They are read as documentation. The reading does not exclude the mythological, liturgical, or political readings. The same text can serve multiple functions for the culture that preserves it. What the reading excludes is the assumption that the documentary function is absent. The documentary function would have to be considered as one of the functions the text served. The documentary readings of Sitchin, Biglino, and others are then admissible into the conversation, where they have not been admissible in mainstream venues. The other consequence is for the categories within which religious studies operates. The category of mythology, as the discipline has used it since the 19th century, has assumed that the materials sorted into the category are imaginative productions, valuable for what they reveal about the culture that produced them, but not for any external referent the culture believed they referred to. The reframing of the materials as documentation calls the category into question. Mythology might be the wrong word for these texts. The right word is the word the cultures themselves used. The Sumerian scribes did not call Inanna's descent a myth. They called it a song. The Egyptian priests did not call the Book of the Dead a myth. They called it the Book of Going Forth by Day. The names are not myths. They are records. Whether they are accurate records is a separate question. That they were intended as records is the answerable one. The intention has been preserved. It is available to any researcher who wants to check. The tablet is in the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. The Papyrus of Ani is in the British Museum. The Bardo Thodol is in print in the W.Y. Evans Wentz edition, published by Oxford University Press in 1927, and the Robert Thurman edition published by Bantam in 1994. The Republic is in every edition of Plato. The Popol Vuh is in the Dennis Tedlock translation published in 1985. Sitchin published his reading in The 12th Planet in 1976. Biglino has published his readings in a sequence of books beginning in 2010. Bond and Hempsel published the Planisphere Analysis in 2008. What the Seven Anuna do when the deceased reaches the bottom of the seven gates, and how their function maps onto the 42 assessors, and the 3 judges, and the Bardo deities, and the lords of Xibalba, and the keeper of the place of emergence is still open. It has been open since Henry Layard first dug Mesopotamian tablets out of the ground at Nineveh in the 1840s. It is still open now.